Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Tigris River moves through the plain as it has for thousands of years, indifferent to the rise and fall of cities. You are standing in what was once the heart of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Yet if you did not know to look for it, you might walk past and see nothing but earth and silence. The walls that once rose here were taller than any in the world. The palaces that stood on this ground were filled with tribute from 100 conquered lands. Kings walked these paths wearing robes of purple and gold, preceded by priests and followed by soldiers whose iron-tipped spears glinted in the sun. This was Assyria, and for 3 centuries it dominated the known world with a power so absolute, so overwhelming, that neighboring kingdoms trembled at the mere rumor of its armies on the march. And yet, today, Assyria is a name half remembered, a shadow in the margins of history. It appears in biblical passages as an instrument of divine wrath, a villain in the ancient stories of Israel and Judah. It lurks in the background of Greek histories, a distant and fearsome empire that had already fallen by the time Herodotus wrote. For most people, it is less familiar than Rome, less vivid than Egypt, less celebrated than Greece. But there was a time when Assyria was the center of the world, when its capital at Nineveh was the largest city on earth, when its kings commanded armies that could move like the wind and crush resistance like grain under a millstone. This empire built the first great libraries, pioneered new forms of warfare, and created administrative systems so efficient that later empires would copy them for centuries. It was an empire of stone-winged bulls and cuneiform tablets, of canals and siege engines, of scribes and spies and soldiers who marched from the mountains of Armenia to the sands of Egypt. To understand Assyria is to glimpse a world both alien and strangely familiar, a civilization that grappled with the same challenges that face all empires: how to govern, how to inspire loyalty, how to maintain order across vast distances and diverse peoples. Tonight you are invited to step back across the millennia and walk through that vanished world. You will see the landscape that shaped these people, the cities they built, the gods they worshipped, and the machinery of power they created. You will stand in palace halls beneath the gaze of carved stone guardians, walk through markets where languages from across the known world mingled in the air, and witness the terrible efficiency of the armies that made Assyria synonymous with conquest. You will also see the quieter moments: the scribes bent over clay tablets in lamplight, the farmers tending irrigation channels, the families lighting incense before household shrines. This is not a story of heroes and villains, but of a civilization in full complexity, neither glorified nor condemned, but understood on its own terms. It is a story that ended in fire and silence, an empire so thoroughly destroyed that for 2,000 years its very existence was doubted. And it is a story that was brought back to life by archaeologists digging in the earth, uncovering palaces and libraries and monuments that tell us who these people were and what they dreamed of building. So settle in now. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let yourself drift back to a time when the world was younger and stranger, when empires rose and fell with a finality we can scarcely imagine, when the great experiment of civilization was still being written in wedge-shaped marks on soft clay. We are going to walk through the ruins of the empire that time forgot, and we are going to remember. The land itself is where we must begin, because everything that Assyria became was shaped by the place where it grew. Imagine standing on a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq, in the region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. To the east, if you look toward the rising sun, you can see the distant line of the Zagros Mountains, their peaks still white with snow even in summer. To the north, the land rises gradually toward the highlands of Anatolia and Armenia. To the south, the plain stretches away toward the great marshes and the distant Persian Gulf, and running through this landscape like arteries are 2 great rivers, the Tigris, swift and unpredictable, and further west the Euphrates, broader and slower in its course toward the sea. The space between these rivers is where human civilization first learned to organize itself into cities and kingdoms, where writing was invented, where the first empires were born. It is a landscape of extremes. In summer, the heat is brutal and unrelenting. The sun beats down from a sky bleached almost white, and the earth bakes hard as stone. There is little shade, and what trees grow here? Date palms, tamarisks, poplars, along the riverbanks, offer only sparse relief. The wind, when it blows, is hot and dry, carrying fine dust that gets into everything: your clothes, your food. the cracks in mud brick walls. You learn to move slowly in the middle of the day, to rest in whatever shade you can find, to wait for evening when the temperature finally begins to drop and the world becomes bearable again. In winter, the rains come, sudden and heavy. The rivers swell and sometimes overflow their banks, turning fields into lakes, washing away poorly built structures, drowning the unwary. The rain brings life. The barley sprouts, the pastures turn green, the flocks grow fat, but it also brings danger. Floods can destroy a year's harvest in a single night. And if the rains fail, if the winter is too dry, then famine follows as surely as drought follows the sun. This is not a forgiving land. It does not offer easy abundance like the Nile Valley, with its predictable annual floods. It demands labor, planning, and control. To live here, you must dig canals to bring water from the rivers to your fields. You must build walls to protect against floods. You must store grain against the lean years, organize labor for the great projects, and defend your territory against raiders from the mountains or the desert. The land teaches you that survival requires discipline, hierarchy, and the ability to mobilize large groups of people toward a common purpose. It teaches you that the world is not naturally generous, that prosperity must be wrung from the earth through sweat and strategy. And it teaches you that your neighbors facing the same challenges will always be a threat or a resource, never simply neutral. In such a place, the strong dominate or they perish. The cities that rose from this landscape were unlike anything that exists today. They were built almost entirely of mud brick, because stone was scarce and had to be imported from the mountains at great expense. The bricks were made from the clay of the riverbanks, mixed with straw, shaped in wooden molds and left to dry in the sun. A good brickmaker could produce thousands in a day, and a city required millions. The result was a landscape of brown and tan, structures that blended into the earth from which they came. But size and scale created their own grandeur. The walls of a major Assyrian city could be 40 feet high and wide enough for chariots to race along the top. They stretched for miles, encompassing not just the urban core, but gardens, orchards, and open spaces where people could take refuge during sieges. Towers rose at regular intervals, and the gates were massive structures, flanked by guardian figures carved from stone brought hundreds of miles from the quarries. Inside the walls, the city was a maze of narrow streets and packed houses, broken by open squares where markets gathered. The homes of ordinary people were small and plain, single-story structures built around central courtyards open to the sky. The courtyard was the heart of domestic life, where cooking was done, where children played, where women worked at looms or ground grain. Rooms opened off the courtyard, dark and cool, used for sleeping and storage. There were no windows facing the street, only blank walls, so that each house turned inward on itself, a private world sealed against the noise and danger of public space. The streets themselves were unpaved, dusty in summer and muddy in winter, lined with the walls of houses and occasionally widening into squares. Donkeys and carts moved through these streets, carrying goods to market. Water sellers walked with their clay jars, calling out their trade. Craftsmen worked in open workshops, potters at their wheels, metal workers at their forges, weavers at their looms. Above the tangle of the lower city, on raised platforms or hills, stood the structures of power, the temples and the palaces. The temples were the houses of the gods, great rectangular buildings with massive walls and no windows except high slits for ventilation. Inside, the air was dim and cool, scented with incense. The central chamber held the statue of the god, an image carved from wood or stone, dressed in fine garments, before which offerings of food and drink were placed daily. The god was not a distant abstraction, but a presence, a lord who dwelt in his house and required service from his people. Priests tended the god, performed rituals at appointed times, read omens in the movements of birds and the patterns of oil on water, and mediated between the divine and human realms. The temple was also an economic institution, owning land, collecting taxes, employing craftsmen, storing wealth. It was a city within the city. And then there were the palaces, the seats of earthly power. If you could stand in the central square of Nineveh or Kalu in the 8th century before the Common Era, you would see before you a structure of almost incomprehensible scale. The palace complex might cover 50 acres or more, raised on a platform of earth and brick so that it loomed over the city like a mountain. Ramps led up to the main gates, and at these gates stood the lamassu, the guardian spirits, colossal stone sculptures combining the body of a bull or lion with the wings of an eagle and the head of a bearded man wearing a horned crown. Each lamassu could weigh 30 tons or more, carved from single blocks of stone and hauled from quarries days or weeks away by teams of men and oxen. They were placed in pairs, flanking the entrances, and they were carved in such a way that from the front they appeared to be standing still, but from the side they seemed to be striding forward. They were not mere decoration but embodiments of protective power, symbols meant to awe visitors and warn enemies. To walk between them was to pass from the ordinary world into the presence of the king, the representative of the god Ashur on earth. The heartland of Assyria was a triangle of land in the upper Tigris region, anchored by 3 great cities. The oldest was Ashur, the original capital, a city perched on a limestone cliff overlooking the river. Ashur was sacred, the dwelling place of the god whose name the city and people bore. It was never abandoned as a religious center, even when the political capital moved elsewhere. Then there was Kallu, known to the Greeks as Nimrud, a great military and administrative center built in the 9th century. And finally Nineveh, the largest and most magnificent of all, which became the supreme capital under the late Assyrian kings. These cities were connected by roads and by the river itself, forming a network of power that radiated outward across an empire that, at its height, stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Arabia, encompassing all of modern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and parts of Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. But to understand how this empire came to be, you must go back to the beginning, to a time when Assyria was not a great power, but a small and vulnerable city-state, struggling to survive in a world dominated by others. The city of Ashur was old even in ancient times. Settlements had existed on that cliff above the Tigris for thousands of years before the Assyrians became a distinct people. The name Ashur belonged first to the god, the patron deity of the city, and only later came to refer to the place and the people who lived there. In the beginning, Ashur was a trading town, well positioned on the routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia to the north and Iran to the east. Merchants from Ashur established colonies in distant lands, trading tin and textiles for silver and gold. They kept meticulous records in cuneiform script on clay tablets, documents that survive today, and give us a picture of a sophisticated commercial network operating in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. But these merchant adventurers lived in a dangerous world. The great powers of the age, the empires of Akkad, Babylon, and later the Mitanni kingdom, treated Ashur as a minor player, a vassal to be controlled or a prize to be contested. For centuries Assyria knew subjugation. Its kings paid tribute to foreign overlords, sent gifts to appease distant courts, and watched helplessly as armies marched through their territory on campaigns that had nothing to do with Assyrian interests. This experience burned itself into the collective memory of the people. They learned to watch, to wait, to study the methods of those who ruled them. They saw how Babylonian kings managed their provinces, how Mitanni warriors fought, how Egyptian diplomats negotiated. They absorbed these lessons and they did not forget. There is a story told in Assyrian royal inscriptions about the early king Shamshi-Adad, who in the 18th century before the Common Era briefly built Assyria into a regional power, only to see his kingdom collapse after his death. His memory was preserved, invoked by later kings as a predecessor and a model. The Assyrians cultivated a sense of historical continuity, a belief that they were heirs to an ancient legacy that demanded restoration and vindication. The turning point came in the 14th century, when the great powers of the region, Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, Mitanni, began to weaken each other through constant warfare. Into this vacuum stepped a series of capable Assyrian kings who started to expand their territory. They did so carefully at first, securing control of the agricultural lands around Ashur, bringing nearby cities under their rule, and building up their military forces. The process took generations. Each king added a little more territory, built a few more fortifications, trained a few more soldiers. They learned that conquest was not a single dramatic event but a long, patient accumulation of small advantages. They learned the importance of logistics, of supply lines, of keeping detailed records of resources and manpower. And they learned, most importantly, that military power alone was not enough. You had to be able to administer what you conquered. to extract resources efficiently, to crush rebellion swiftly, and to project an image of invincible might that made resistance seem futile. By the 13th century, Assyria had become a significant regional power, controlling much of northern Mesopotamia. But it was still not secure. To the south, Babylon remained a rival, rich and culturally prestigious. To the west, new groups were emerging in Syria. To the north and east, the mountain peoples raided the plains when they grew strong. Assyria was surrounded by potential threats, and the geography offered no natural defenses. There was no great mountain range to hide behind, no sea to protect one flank. Security could only come through expansion, through pushing the borders far enough out that enemies could be met and defeated before they threatened the heartland. This logic drove Assyrian foreign policy for the next 500 years. It was not enough to defeat an enemy. You had to destroy their ability to resist, to make an example so terrible that others would submit without a fight. The character of the Assyrian state was forged in these centuries of struggle. It became a society organized for war, not because its people were inherently more violent than others, but because their geopolitical situation demanded it. The king was first and foremost a military leader, the commander of the army and the agent of the god Ashur, whose divine command was to extend order over chaos. The nobility were a warrior aristocracy, landowners who owed military service and brought their retainers to the king's campaigns. The temples supported the military through prayers and rituals, and they benefited from the spoils of war. Even the common people, the farmers and craftsmen, were organized into labor units that could be mobilized for building projects or military campaigns. Everything was systematized, recorded, and controlled. The Assyrians developed a sophisticated bureaucracy staffed by scribes who could read and write cuneiform, who kept track of tribute payments, military rosters, and the movement of goods across the empire. Information was power, and the Assyrian state collected information with an efficiency that would not be matched until the Persian Empire centuries later. The religion of Assyria was centered on the god Ashur, who had no mythology like the great gods of other peoples. He was not a storm god, or a sun god, or a god of wisdom. He was the god of Assyria itself, the embodiment of the city and the nation. His will was expressed through the king, and his command was simple: expand the land of Ashur. Bring order to the world, subdue the forces of chaos represented by foreign peoples who did not acknowledge his supremacy. This gave Assyrian warfare a quasi-religious character. Conquest was not merely political or economic. It was a sacred duty. The king who failed to campaign, who allowed enemies to grow strong, who did not extend the borders, was failing in his fundamental obligation to the god. This ideology appears again and again in royal inscriptions carved on palace walls and cliff faces across the empire. The king recounts his campaigns, lists the cities he destroyed, the kings he defeated, the tribute he collected, and presents all of it as the fulfillment of divine will. It is important to understand this mindset, because without it, the scale of Assyrian violence makes no sense. The Assyrians were not uniquely cruel by the standards of the ancient world. All empires used terror and brutality as tools of control. But they were systematic about it, and they documented it in a way that other cultures did not. They wanted their enemies to know what would happen if they resisted. The stone reliefs that lined the walls of Assyrian palaces showed in graphic detail the fate of rebels, cities under siege, battering rams smashing gates, soldiers scaling walls, captives being led away in chains, executions carried out with methodical precision. These were not meant to be hidden in private chambers but were displayed in public halls where foreign ambassadors and vassals would see them and carry the message home. The message was clear: submit and you will be allowed to live under Assyrian protection, pay your tribute and keep your local rulers. Resist and you will be utterly destroyed, your city burned, your population deported, your name erased from the land. This brings us to the instrument of Assyrian power, the thing that made all of it possible: the army. In the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, the Assyrian military became the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen. It was not simply larger than other armies, though at its peak it may have numbered over 100,000 men. It was more professional, better organized, more technologically advanced, and more experienced than any rival. Let us walk through this war machine and understand how it worked. The backbone of the army was the infantry, men armed with spears, bows, and swords, protected by bronze or iron helmets, scale armor, and large rectangular shields. These soldiers were organized into units with clear chains of command, each unit led by officers who reported to higher commanders. They trained regularly, practiced formations, and learned to move as a coordinated mass rather than a mob of individual warriors. The Assyrians did not rely solely on a citizen militia that assembled only when war threatened. They maintained a standing army, professional soldiers who served year-round, who were paid and equipped by the state, and whose loyalty was to the king rather than to local nobles. This was a revolutionary development, and it gave Assyria an enormous advantage. While other kingdoms struggled to raise and supply armies for short campaigns, the Assyrian king could mobilize his forces at any time and keep them in the field for months or even years. The army also included cavalry, a relatively new development in Near Eastern warfare. Earlier armies had used chariots, two-wheeled vehicles drawn by horses, and carrying a driver and one or two warriors armed with bows or spears. Chariots were fast and terrifying, but limited by terrain and expensive to maintain. The Assyrians continued to use chariots, but also developed units of mounted archers, men who rode horses directly and could shoot arrows while moving at speed. This required tremendous skill and years of practice, and the Assyrians invested in breeding programs to produce the right kind of horses, strong enough to carry an armored man but agile enough to maneuver in battle. Cavalry gave the army unprecedented mobility, allowing rapid strikes deep into enemy territory, the ability to scout ahead of the main force, and the capacity to pursue and destroy fleeing enemies. But perhaps the most fearsome aspect of the Assyrian military was its mastery of siege warfare. Many ancient cities were protected by massive walls and could withstand attacks for months or even years, waiting for disease or starvation to force the besiegers to withdraw. The Assyrians developed techniques and technologies to overcome these defenses. They built siege towers, multi-story wooden structures on wheels that could be pushed up to enemy walls, allowing soldiers to fight at the same height as the defenders. They constructed battering rams, heavy wooden beams tipped with metal, suspended from frames and swung repeatedly against gates or weak points in walls until the masonry cracked and gave way. They dug tunnels under walls, shoring them up with wooden supports that would then be set on fire, causing the tunnel to collapse and the wall above to fall. They diverted water supplies, cut off food deliveries, and employed psychological warfare, shouting threats and promises to the defenders, offering clemency to those who surrendered early and promising annihilation to those who resisted to the end. The army moved with a logistical train that was itself a marvel of organization. Thousands of pack animals, donkeys, mules, oxen, carried food, water, weapons, and equipment. Engineers accompanied the force to build bridges over rivers, clear roads through forests, and construct camps each night. Scribes recorded the progress of the campaign, the numbers of enemy killed or captured, the amounts of loot taken. Medical personnel tended to the wounded, though ancient medicine could do little for serious injuries and death from infected wounds was common. The army was a city on the move, requiring constant coordination to function. Officers held councils each evening to plan the next day's march or the next stage of a siege. Scouts ranged far ahead, looking for enemy forces or suitable campsites. Foragers scoured the countryside for food, either purchasing it from local populations or simply taking it. An army that lived off the land it moved through was both a practical necessity and a weapon in itself, impoverishing enemy territories and enriching Assyrian coffers with plunder. Iron was the great technological advantage that underpinned Assyrian military supremacy. Earlier armies had used bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, for weapons and armor. Bronze is strong and can take a good edge, but the tin required to make it had to be imported from distant sources, making it expensive. Iron, by contrast, was abundant. Iron ore could be found in many regions, including the mountains north and east of Assyria. The challenge was in smelting it, heating the ore to high enough temperatures to separate the metal from the rock. This required specialized furnaces and considerable skill, but by the 9th century the Assyrians had mastered the process. Iron weapons were not necessarily better than bronze in every respect, but they were cheaper to produce in large quantities, and they could be made harder through techniques like quenching and tempering. An iron-tipped spear could pierce bronze armor. An iron sword would not bend or break as easily in the shock of combat. The Assyrians equipped entire units with iron weapons and armor, giving them a decisive edge over enemies still relying primarily on bronze. But technology alone does not win wars. What made the Assyrian army truly formidable was experience and morale. These were men who campaigned year after year, who had seen dozens of battles, who knew how to work together under pressure. They trusted their commanders because those commanders had led them to victory time and again. They believed in the power of their God and the invincibility of their king. They shared in the spoils of war. A successful campaign meant not just survival but enrichment, a chance to bring home gold, silver, fine cloth, and slaves. There was also the negative motivation of fear. Deserters or cowards could expect no mercy. The Assyrian state kept detailed records, and a soldier who fled the battlefield might find his family punished in his place. The combination of professional pride, religious conviction, material incentive, and harsh discipline created a military culture that was nearly unbreakable. The psychological impact of this army cannot be overstated. When word spread that an Assyrian force was approaching, entire regions would often submit without a fight. Kings would send ambassadors bearing tribute, hoping to avoid destruction. Cities would open their gates and plead for mercy. The Assyrians cultivated this fear deliberately, not out of sadism, but as a calculated strategy to minimize their own losses. It was far more efficient to intimidate enemies into surrender than to besiege every city and fight every battle. The propaganda of terror, the reliefs showing executions, the inscriptions boasting of cities destroyed and populations deported, served a practical purpose. It advertised the cost of resistance and made submission seem like the only rational choice. Yet for all their military might, the Assyrians understood that armies alone do not build empires. You can conquer a city, but you cannot garrison every village and watch every road. You need systems, institutions, and a bureaucracy capable of governing vast territories populated by diverse peoples who speak different languages and worship different gods. The Assyrian solution to this problem was one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the ancient world, a model that would be studied and adapted by later empires from the Persians to the Romans. At the heart of this system was the king, but the king was not an absolute autocrat in the way we might imagine. He was bound by tradition, by the expectations of the nobility, and above all by his duty to the god Ashur. Each king, upon ascending the throne, underwent a coronation ritual in the temple at Ashur, where he received the symbols of power and made vows to uphold justice, protect the people, and extend the land of Ashur. These were not empty words. A king who neglected his duties, who allowed the empire to weaken, or who ruled unjustly could lose the support of the nobility and the priesthood, and with it his throne. Succession was not always smooth. Although the king usually tried to designate a son as heir, rivalries among princes could lead to civil war, and several Assyrian kings came to power through violence and intrigue. The palace was a place of constant maneuvering, where officials, generals, and royal family members competed for influence and favor. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by an official appointed by the king. These governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, raising troops when needed, and overseeing major construction projects like irrigation, canals, and roads. They were also the eyes and ears of the central government, sending regular reports to the capital on everything from harvest yields to rumors of rebellion. The position of provincial governor was one of great power but also great danger. A governor who proved incompetent or disloyal could be removed and punished, his lands confiscated, his family disgraced. The king maintained a network of spies and inspectors who moved through the provinces, checking on the governors, listening for complaints, and ensuring that tribute was being collected honestly. This system of surveillance created a climate of fear and efficiency. Officials knew they were being watched, and this kept corruption somewhat in check, though it never disappeared entirely. Tribute was the lifeblood of the empire. Conquered territories were required to send regular payments to the capital, usually in the form of goods rather than money. Grain, wine, oil, livestock, metals, timber, textiles. The amounts were carefully calculated based on the productivity of each region, and the records were kept in the royal archives. Failure to pay tribute was a serious offense and could trigger a military response, but the Assyrians were not simply extracting wealth without offering anything in return. The empire provided security. Assyrian roads were patrolled and trade caravans could move with relative safety. Disputes between cities or tribes were settled by imperial officials, preventing the small-scale raiding and feuding that had plagued the region in earlier times. There was a rough kind of justice in this system, a pax Assyriaca that allowed commerce and agriculture to flourish under the shadow of imperial power. One of the most controversial and effective policies of the Assyrian state was mass deportation. When a city or region rebelled and was reconquered, the Assyrians would often deport large portions of the population, moving them hundreds of miles away to other parts of the empire. This served multiple purposes. It broke up communities that might organize future resistance. It provided labor for major building projects or for settling underpopulated regions. It mixed populations so that no single ethnic or linguistic group could dominate a province. And it demonstrated the absolute power of the king to reshape the human landscape at will. The scale of these deportations was enormous. Royal inscriptions boast of moving tens or even hundreds of thousands of people at a time. Families were torn from their ancestral lands, marched for weeks across deserts and mountains, and resettled in strange places where they did not speak the language or know the customs. It was a brutal policy, and it caused immense suffering. But from the perspective of the Assyrian state, it worked. Rebellions became less frequent as people realized the cost of defiance, and the empire became more culturally unified as different groups were forced to interact and integrate. The administrative apparatus required to manage all of this was vast. The royal palace in Nineveh, or Kalhu, was not just a residence but the central office of the empire. Hundreds of scribes worked in its halls, writing letters, recording transactions, copying texts, and maintaining archives. Cuneiform script, with its wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay, was the medium of all official communication. A scribe had to memorize hundreds of signs, each representing a syllable or a word, and be able to write quickly and legibly. Training took years, often beginning in childhood, and scribes formed a specialized class, respected for their learning and essential to the functioning of the state. The archives they created are one of the great gifts of Assyria to the modern world. Tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered from palace sites, and they tell us in extraordinary detail how the empire worked. Letters from governors reporting on local conditions, inventories of tribute received, contracts for building projects, legal documents settling disputes, medical texts, astronomical observations, hymns, prayers, and myths. The palace itself was a wonder. A complex of hundreds of rooms organized around open courtyards. The king's private apartments were in the innermost part, accessible only to family and trusted servants. Surrounding these were the administrative offices, the audience halls where the king received ambassadors and petitioners, the throne room where he sat in judgment and issued commands, and the ceremonial spaces where rituals were performed. The walls of the major halls were lined with stone reliefs, carved panels showing the king in his various roles, hunting lions, leading the army, receiving tribute, performing religious ceremonies. These reliefs were both decoration and propaganda, presenting an idealized image of kingship that visitors would remember and report to their home countries. The ceilings were supported by massive beams of cedar, imported at great expense from the mountains of Lebanon. The floors were paved with stone or covered with thick wool carpets. Light came from high windows and from oil lamps burning in wall niches. The whole complex was a statement of power, wealth, and permanence, designed to awe and intimidate. Outside the palace, the capital city bustled with life. Nineveh at its height may have had a population of over 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The majority were not Assyrians, but members of the many ethnic groups that made up the empire. Arameans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Medes, Greeks. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and followed different customs, but they all lived under Assyrian rule and contributed to the city's cosmopolitan character. The markets were a cacophony of sound and color. Merchants shouted in a dozen tongues, advertising their wares. You could buy grain from the plains of Babylonia, dates from the south, wine from the western hills, olive oil from the Mediterranean coast, horses from the northern pastures, iron tools from local smiths, pottery, both plain and decorated, linen from Egypt, wool dyed with expensive purple from Phoenicia, incense from Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Coins were not yet in widespread use. Transactions were conducted through barter or weighed silver, cut from larger ingots and measured on scales. The city's water supply was a marvel of engineering. Nineveh was supplied by a system of canals and aqueducts that brought water from streams in the mountains miles away. The most famous of these was commissioned by King Sennacherib in the early 7th century. This aqueduct crossed a valley on a bridge of stone arches, carrying water to the city's gardens and fountains. It was the first known use of a true arch in large-scale engineering in this part of the world, predating Roman aqueducts by centuries. The gardens themselves were legendary. Sennacherib created a great park within the city, planting trees and plants from across the empire, irrigated by the canal system. Some scholars believe that this park, not the gardens in Babylon, was the true origin of the legend of the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Whether or not that is true, the gardens were a symbol of the king's power to command nature itself, to make the desert bloom, to bring the distant corners of the empire together in one cultivated landscape. Daily life for ordinary people in Nineveh followed rhythms little different from those of other ancient cities. Men worked as craftsmen, laborers, merchants, or in service to the state. Women managed households, raised children, wove cloth, and prepared food. Children played in the streets until old enough to begin learning a trade, or in wealthy families to receive an education. The diet was based on barley, wheat, lentils, onions, and dates, supplemented with fish from the river, mutton or goat meat on special occasions, and beer, which was thick, nutritious, and drunk by everyone from children to the king. Bread was baked daily in clay ovens. Meals were eaten sitting on the floor, or on low stools. Food served on pottery plates, or eaten with the fingers from a common dish. Religion permeated daily life in ways that are hard for modern people to fully grasp. The gods were not abstract concepts, but real presences who intervened in human affairs. Every household had a small shrine, where offerings were made to protective deities. Before any important undertaking, a journey, a business deal, a marriage, people consulted omens. Priests or diviners would examine the liver of a sacrificed sheep, looking for irregularities that indicated divine will, or observe the flight of birds, or interpret dreams. If the omens were bad, the undertaking might be postponed or abandoned. This was not superstition in the modern sense, but a rational response to an uncertain world. If the gods controlled events, then it made sense to seek their guidance and favor. Temples received constant traffic, people bringing offerings of food, drink, or incense, seeking blessings, or giving thanks for good fortune. The great festivals of the religious calendar were communal events that brought the entire city together. The most important was the New Year festival, celebrated at the spring equinox. This was a time when the creation of the world was ritually reenacted, when the king's divine mandate was renewed, when the chaos of the old year was symbolically defeated, and the order of the new year established. Processions moved through the streets, carrying statues of the gods. Hymns were sung, sacrifices performed, feasts held. For a few days the normal hierarchies relaxed slightly, and even the poorest people could share in the festivities. These festivals were essential to the cohesion of the empire. They reminded people of their shared identity as subjects of Ashur, reinforced the legitimacy of the king, and provided moments of joy and release in lives that were often hard and uncertain. But beneath the grandeur and the efficiency, there were always tensions. The empire was too large, too diverse, and too dependent on military force to ever be truly stable. Governors in distant provinces sometimes withheld tribute, testing the king's resolve. Vassal kings looked for opportunities to break free. When a strong king died and was succeeded by a weaker or younger one, rebellions would erupt across the empire. The Assyrian response was always the same: swift, overwhelming military force followed by collective punishment. This pattern repeated itself generation after generation, each king spending his reign putting down the rebellions that had erupted during the transition of power, campaigning to restore order, and then, if time allowed, expanding the borders further before his own death started the cycle again. One figure stands out in this history as a symbol of what Assyria became at its peak: the king Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the mid-7th century. He was a warrior like all Assyrian kings, leading campaigns into Egypt and against the rebellious kings of Babylon. But he was also a scholar, a man who valued learning and who created one of the ancient world's greatest libraries. This library, housed in his palace at Nineveh, was not a random collection, but a deliberate attempt to gather all the knowledge of the known world. Ashurbanipal sent scribes across the empire with instructions to copy every text they could find: myths, epics, medical treatises, astronomical tables, omen collections, rituals, prayers, historical chronicles, letters, legal documents. The result was a collection of over 30,000 tablets, representing the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization stretching back 2,000 years. Among the treasures of this library was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient story of a king's quest for immortality, one of the earliest great works of literature. There were medical texts describing diseases and their treatments, combining careful observation with magical incantations. There were astronomical tablets recording the movements of planets and stars, observations that would later be transmitted to Greek astronomers and form the basis of Western astronomy. There were lists of omens: if a woman gives birth to twins, if a sheep's liver has a certain shape, if the moon appears in a particular part of the sky, then such and such will happen. To modern eyes, much of this seems irrational, but it represented a serious attempt to find patterns in the world, to predict and control events through knowledge. The library tells us something important about how the Assyrians saw themselves. They were not merely conquerors but inheritors and preservers of an ancient civilization. They saw themselves as the rightful rulers of Mesopotamia, the land where writing had been invented, where the first cities had risen, where the gods had first taught humanity the arts of civilization. When Ashurbanipal's scribes copied a Babylonian text, they were asserting continuity with that tradition, claiming it as their own. The tension between Assyria and Babylon was partly military and political, but it was also cultural. Babylon was older, more prestigious, the cultural and religious heart of southern Mesopotamia. Assyrian kings often ruled Babylon directly, but they had to do so carefully, respecting its temples and traditions, because to be seen as a barbarian destroyer of Babylonian culture would undermine their legitimacy in the eyes of the educated elite. The library was one way Ashurbanipal demonstrated that he was not merely a warrior but a civilized king, worthy to rule the heirs of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. The irony is that this same library, buried when Nineveh burned, would survive the destruction of the city and the empire, lying hidden under the earth for 2.5 millennia until archaeologists brought it back to light in the 19th century. It would become one of the most important sources for our understanding of the ancient Near East, providing texts that had been lost everywhere else, preserving voices that would otherwise have been silenced forever. The warrior king who built an empire of fear also built a monument to knowledge that outlasted his dynasty and his gods. But we are getting ahead of our story. To understand the fall, we must first understand the height. Let us walk through the empire at its greatest extent, in the decades around 650 before the Common Era, when Assyrian armies had reached the Nile Delta and the king's word was law from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Imagine yourself as a traveler in this empire, moving along one of the great roads that connected the provinces to the capital. These roads were not paved with stone like Roman roads would be centuries later, but they were well maintained, cleared of obstacles, and marked at regular intervals with rest stations where travelers could find water and shelter. The road itself might be nothing more than packed earth, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, hooves, and wheels. In the rainy season it became a river of mud, nearly impassable, but for most of the year it was serviceable. You would not travel alone. The roads were safe by ancient standards, but banditry was always a risk, so merchants and pilgrims banded together in caravans, hiring guards if they carried valuable goods. As you moved through the countryside, you would see the evidence of Assyrian power everywhere. Fields were irrigated by canals that had been dug by state labor crews. Watchtowers stood on hilltops, where soldiers kept watch for raiders or smugglers. Villages were clustered along the road, their headmen responsible for providing supplies to passing officials and troops. Every few days you would pass through a larger town, fortified with walls, where a local garrison was stationed and where the provincial governor's representative maintained a court. These officials were not Assyrian in most cases, but locals who had submitted to Assyrian rule and now governed on behalf of the empire. They wore Assyrian-style robes, spoke Aramaic or Akkadian in addition to their native language, and sent their sons to be educated in Assyrian cities. They were collaborators, the essential intermediaries who made the empire function, rewarded with power and wealth as long as they remained loyal, and destroyed utterly if they did not. If you traveled far enough west, you would eventually reach the Mediterranean coast, where Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon paid tribute to Assyria while maintaining their own kings and conducting their trade. These were ancient ports, their harbors filled with ships that sailed to Cyprus, to Egypt, to Greece, and even beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the unknown Western Ocean. The Phoenicians were master sailors and traders, and the Assyrians were wise enough not to interfere too much with their affairs, as long as the tribute flowed. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Assyrian power protected the trade routes from bandits and rival kingdoms, and Phoenician merchants brought exotic goods to Assyrian markets: purple-dyed cloth, cedar wood, ivory, glass, and slaves. To the south, the empire extended into the Levant, the land that would become famous as the homeland of the Israelites and Judeans. This region was a patchwork of small kingdoms, city-states, and tribal territories, all of which fell under Assyrian control during the 8th and 7th centuries. The Kingdom of Israel, the northern of the two Hebrew kingdoms, was conquered and its population deported in 722 before the Common Era, an event recorded both in Assyrian annals and in the Hebrew Bible. The southern kingdom of Judah survived as a vassal state, paying tribute and submitting to Assyrian overlordship. The biblical prophets railed against Assyria as an instrument of divine punishment, a scourge sent to chastise Israel for its sins, but also predicted that Assyria itself would one day fall. The relationship between Judah and Assyria was uneasy, marked by occasional rebellions that were crushed, and by long periods of sullen submission. Further south still, the Assyrians pushed into Egypt, the oldest and most prestigious civilization of the ancient world. The conquest of Egypt was the crowning achievement of the empire, a symbolic demonstration that no power on earth could stand against Assyria. But Egypt was also the beginning of the end, because it stretched Assyrian resources to the breaking point. The logistics of governing a territory so far from the heartland, across hundreds of miles of desert, proved nearly impossible. Egyptian resistance never fully died out, and the Assyrians were eventually forced to withdraw, leaving Egypt to native dynasties and Libyan and later Persian conquerors. To the east, the empire bordered the highlands of Iran, home to the Medes and Persians, peoples who were not yet unified but whose potential power was growing. To the north, the mountains of Anatolia and Armenia were home to the kingdom of Urartu, a rival that fought Assyria to a standstill for over a century before being weakened by northern invaders. In all directions, the empire faced challenges, and maintaining control required constant vigilance and periodic shows of force. The sheer scale of the empire created problems that no amount of military might could fully solve. Communication across such distances was slow. A message from the capital to a distant province might take weeks to arrive, and by the time a response came back, the situation could have changed entirely. Provincial governors had considerable autonomy because they had to make decisions on their own, without waiting for instructions from the king. This autonomy created opportunities for corruption and disloyalty. Governors enriched themselves at the expense of the central treasury, withheld troops when needed, and sometimes plotted independence. The king's response was to rotate governors frequently, to send inspectors and spies, and to rely on a network of informants. But even these measures could not eliminate the structural problem. The empire was too big to be governed effectively from a single center with the technology of the time. There were also economic strains. The constant military campaigns, while they brought in tribute and plunder, also required enormous expenditures. Equipping and feeding an army of tens of thousands of men, maintaining the roads and fortifications, supporting the bureaucracy, and funding the monumental building projects that advertised the king's glory all drained resources. The temples and the nobility took their share as well. The burden fell ultimately on the peasantry, the farmers who worked the land and who had to provide grain, labor, and sons for the army. When harvests failed, when wars went badly, when too much was demanded too quickly, the system could break down. There are hints in the records of the late Assyrian period of economic stress, of lands going uncultivated, of people fleeing to avoid tax collectors. And there was the question of succession. Assyrian kings often tried to ensure a smooth transition by designating a crown prince during their lifetime, educating him in the arts of rulership, and associating him with royal ceremonies. But this did not always prevent conflict. Brothers and uncles might have their own claims, or might be pushed forward by factions among the nobility or the priesthood. Civil wars over succession weakened the empire and invited rebellion from subject peoples. The death of a strong king was always a moment of maximum danger. Yet for all these problems, the empire endured for over 2 centuries at its height, a remarkable achievement. It endured because it was not simply a machine of oppression, but a system that provided real benefits to at least some of its subjects. The elites of conquered territories found opportunities for advancement in Assyrian service. Merchants profited from the security and extent of the imperial market. Even ordinary people might benefit from the peace and the infrastructure, as long as they did not rebel and draw down the wrath of the army. The end, when it came, was swift and total. In the late 7th century, the empire began to unravel. The exact sequence of events is still debated by historians, because the records become fragmentary and contradictory, but the broad outline is clear. Babylon, which had been conquered and reconquered multiple times, rose in rebellion once more under a new dynasty. To the east, the Medes, a people who had been subjects and sometime allies of Assyria, unified under a powerful king and turned against their former overlords. The two powers allied, a coalition of enemies who had suffered under Assyrian rule and now saw their chance for revenge. The war that followed was brutal and desperate. Assyrian armies, which had always been able to crush rebellions through superior numbers and tactics, now found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who had learned from Assyrian methods. The Babylonians besieged Assyrian cities in the south. The Medes invaded from the east. Assyrian resources, stretched thin by decades of campaigning and internal strife, began to fail. One by one, the great cities fell. Ashur, the ancient religious capital, was captured and burned. Kalu fell. And finally, in 612 before the Common Era, the Medes and Babylonians laid siege to Nineveh itself. The siege of Nineveh was one of the epic events of ancient history, though the details are lost to us. The city's walls were among the strongest in the world, its garrison still numbered in the thousands, and it had supplies to withstand a long siege. But the combined armies of Babylon and Media were vast, and they were motivated by a desire for vengeance as much as by strategic calculation. According to later tradition, the city fell after the Tigris River flooded, weakening a section of the wall and allowing the attackers to break through. Whether this is literally true or a symbolic story is unclear, but the result was certain. Nineveh was taken by storm. What followed was a sack of extraordinary thoroughness. The palaces were looted and then burned. The temples were desecrated, their treasures carried off. The population was massacred or enslaved. The city was systematically destroyed, its walls torn down, its buildings razed. The conquerors wanted to ensure that Nineveh would never rise again, and they succeeded. The fires burned so hot that they baked the clay tablets in Ashurbanipal's library, inadvertently preserving them for the future, even as the rest of the city turned to ash and rubble. Within a few years, the site was abandoned. Vegetation grew over the ruins. The Tigris changed its course slightly, and the area became farmland and pasture. Within a generation, no one lived there who remembered the glory of the city. A remnant of the Assyrian state tried to continue the fight from the western city of Haran, but this last holdout fell within a few years. The Assyrian people did not disappear. Their descendants continued to live in northern Mesopotamia, and indeed small communities of Assyrians exist to this day, but the empire was gone forever. The Babylonians and Medes divided the territory between them. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II would build his own empire and create his own version of the Hanging Gardens, but it too would fall within a century to the Persians. The Persians would build the largest empire the world had yet seen, but they would model their administration in part on Assyrian precedents. History moved on. The destruction of Assyria was so complete that later generations could scarcely believe it had existed. The Hebrew prophets, writing in the aftermath, celebrated the fall as divine justice. The Book of Nahum is a long poem of rejoicing over Nineveh's destruction, calling it a city of blood, a den of lions now laid waste and empty. The Greek historians knew of Assyria only dimly, as a semi-legendary empire that had existed long before their time. Herodotus mentions it briefly. Xenophon, marching through Mesopotamia with the 10,000 in the 4th century, camped near the ruins of a great city, but he did not know its name or its history. The local people told him it had been destroyed long ago, but they had no memory of who had built it. For over 2,000 years, Nineveh was a name in ancient texts, a city that had been great and was now gone, but whose physical remains were unknown. Travelers in the region noted the large mounds of earth and broken brick that dotted the landscape around Mosul, but they did not recognize them as the ruins of cities. The tells, as these mounds are called, are the accumulated debris of ancient settlements, layer upon layer of mud brick buildings that collapsed, were rebuilt, collapsed again, over centuries or millennia. When finally abandoned, they became hills, grass-covered and inconspicuous. Shepherds grazed their flocks on them, farmers plowed their slopes, Occasionally someone would find a broken fragment of sculpture or a clay tablet, but these were curiosities, not clues to a lost civilization. The rediscovery began in the 19th century, part of the great age of archaeological exploration that saw Europeans racing to uncover the ancient civilizations of the Near East. In the 1840s, a French diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Paul-Émile Botta began excavating at a site called Khorsabad, north of Mosul. He uncovered the remains of a palace, its walls lined with carved stone reliefs showing bearded kings and winged bulls. He had found the palace of Sargon II, an Assyrian king who had built a new capital in the 8th century. Botta's finds caused a sensation in Europe. Here was physical proof of the Assyrian Empire, not just a biblical reference but a real civilization with art, architecture, and writing. A few years later, a young Englishman named Austin Henry Layard began digging at a mound across the river from Mosul, a site the locals called Kuyunjik. Layard was convinced that this was Nineveh, and he was right. His excavations uncovered the palace of Sennacherib and later the palace of Ashurbanipal. He found rooms filled with stone reliefs depicting battles, hunts, and religious ceremonies. He found the library, thousands of clay tablets piled in the palace rooms where they had been stored when the city burned. He uncovered the lamassu, the great human-headed bulls, and organized their transport to London, a feat of engineering and determination that captured the public imagination. The discovery of the library was perhaps the most significant archaeological find of the century. Scholars in London began the slow work of deciphering the cuneiform script and reading the tablets. Among them was George Smith, a young engraver who taught himself to read cuneiform and was hired by the British Museum. In 1872, Smith was working through a tablet when he realized he was reading a flood story very similar to the biblical account of Noah's Ark, but predating the biblical text by over 1,000 years. This was a revelation. It suggested that the biblical stories had their roots in older Mesopotamian traditions, that the Bible was not a unique revelation but part of a broader cultural context. The implications for biblical scholarship and theology were profound and are still being worked out. Over the following decades, archaeologists continued to excavate Assyrian sites. They uncovered the great cities, mapped the palaces, copied the inscriptions, and removed countless artifacts to museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and elsewhere. This work was not always careful or respectful. Early excavators were treasure hunters, as much as scholars, focused on finding spectacular objects to ship home rather than on understanding the sites as a whole. They dug quickly, often damaging structures and losing valuable contextual information. They divided finds among sponsoring institutions according to international agreements that gave the excavating nations the majority of discoveries. The result is that much of Assyria's material heritage is now scattered in museums around the world, far from the land where it was created. But the work also produced a genuine revolution in historical understanding. For the first time, ancient Mesopotamian civilization could be studied on its own terms, through its own words, rather than filtered through Greek or biblical sources. Assyrian royal inscriptions provided detailed accounts of campaigns, building projects, and religious ceremonies. Letters between kings and their officials revealed the workings of government and the personalities of the rulers. Legal documents, economic tablets, and scholarly texts showed how ordinary people lived, what they worried about, what they believed. An entire world came back to life, and with it a more complex and nuanced picture of the ancient Near East. The Assyrians themselves, as they emerged from the tablets and reliefs, were not simple villains. They were human beings, wrestling with the challenges of their time: how to create order in a violent world, how to govern diverse peoples, how to preserve knowledge and culture, how to understand the will of the gods and the movements of the stars. They built an empire through ruthless military force, but they also built libraries, canals, and roads. They practiced terror as state policy, but they also created law codes, supported scholarship, and patronized the arts. To condemn them entirely is to miss the historical context in which they operated, a world where might made right and where the alternatives to imperial order were chaos and constant warfare. To celebrate them uncritically is to ignore the suffering they caused, the peoples they destroyed, the individuals who died on their campaigns or were torn from their homes in deportations. The legacy of Assyria is complicated. In the modern Middle East, the name carries different meanings for different groups. For Assyrian Christians, descendants of the ancient population who converted to Christianity in the early centuries of the Common Era and who still speak a language related to ancient Aramaic. Assyria is a source of identity and pride, a connection to a glorious past. For Iraqi nationalists, the Assyrian Empire is part of the national heritage, proof that Iraq has been a center of civilization for millennia. For others, particularly those influenced by biblical narratives, Assyria remains a symbol of oppression and imperial arrogance. The physical remains of Assyria continue to be vulnerable. In the early 21st century, the region where most Assyrian sites are located became a war zone. The archaeological sites at Nineveh, Kalhu, and elsewhere suffered damage from looting, from fighting, and from deliberate destruction by extremist groups who saw the ancient monuments as idolatrous and sought to erase them. Videos showed militants smashing statues in the Mosul Museum using sledgehammers and drills to destroy sculptures that had survived for nearly 3,000 years. At Nimrud, they used explosives to demolish the site, reducing palaces and temples to rubble. The loss was incalculable, not just to archaeology but to human heritage. And yet, even in the face of such destruction, the story of Assyria endures. The tablets, scattered in museums and universities around the world, continue to be studied. New translations appear, shedding light on aspects of Assyrian culture that were previously obscure. Digital projects aim to create virtual reconstructions of the palaces and cities, allowing people to walk through them as they might have appeared in ancient times. Scholars debate the interpretation of texts, the chronology of kings, the causes of the empire's rise and fall. And slowly, in Iraq, efforts are underway to repair the damage, to preserve what remains, to reclaim this heritage for the future. If you visit the site of Nineveh today, you will find a landscape that is at once utterly changed and strangely familiar. The ancient city walls, or what remains of them, still mark out the perimeter of the site, a rough rectangle several miles across. Much of the area is now occupied by the modern city of Mosul, but parts remain open, grassy fields dotted with mounds and occasional fragments of masonry. The great palace mounds of Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus rise above the plain. Excavations over the years have exposed sections of palace walls, and a few of the carved reliefs remain in situ, protected by modern shelters. But most of the site is still buried, and much of what was excavated in the 19th century has deteriorated or been destroyed. Standing there in the early morning when the light is soft and the air is still cool, you can almost feel the weight of history. The wind moves through the grass, and if you close your eyes you can imagine the sounds that once filled this place. The shouts of soldiers drilling in the courtyards, the chanting of priests in the temples, the rumble of carts carrying tribute through the gates, the voices of scribes reading aloud in the palace halls. You can imagine the great festivals, the processions of gods and kings, the roar of the crowds. You can imagine the final days, the terror as the enemy armies closed in, the fires that consumed the palaces, the silence that fell afterward. But you can also imagine the quieter moments, a scribe finishing his day's work, carefully storing his tablets in a jar, a mother singing a lullaby to her child in the evening, a merchant closing a deal in the marketplace, satisfied with his profit, a priest studying the stars from the temple roof, recording their positions for the king's astrologers. These were the real texture of life in Nineveh, the everyday activities that continued beneath the grand narrative of empire and conquest. They are harder to recover than the stories of kings and battles, but they are no less real, no less human. The ruins stand as a reminder of the impermanence of all human achievement. The empire that seemed invincible, that controlled the world for centuries, disappeared in a generation. The palaces that took decades to build burned in days. The libraries that preserved the accumulated knowledge of millennia were buried under rubble and forgotten. And yet, something survived. The tablets endured because clay hardens when it burns. The stories survived because they were worth remembering, copied and recopied across generations. The idea of Assyria survived because it had left such a deep impression on the peoples who encountered it, for good or ill. In the end, Assyria is important, not because it was uniquely good or uniquely evil, but because it was an early attempt to solve a problem that still confronts us. How do you create order across diverse populations and vast territories? The Assyrians solved it through military force, administrative efficiency, and a sophisticated understanding of propaganda and terror. Their solution worked for a time, but it also sowed the seeds of its own destruction. because empires built on fear and extraction cannot inspire genuine loyalty. When the military machine faltered, when the subject peoples saw their chance, they rose up and destroyed their oppressors with a thoroughness that matched Assyria's own methods. Later empires learned from this. The Persians, who built on Assyrian foundations, ruled with a lighter touch, allowing local autonomy and respecting local customs. The Romans created systems of law and citizenship that bound their empire together with something more than force. But they too eventually fell, and their ruins are scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean, monuments to the same lesson, that power alone is never enough, that empires rise and fall, that nothing lasts forever except the stories we tell. As you stand among the tells of Nineveh, as the sun rises and the heat begins to build, you might think about what this place represents.
It is a memorial to ambition, to the human drive to build something great, to leave a mark on the world that will
outlast individual lives. It is a warning about the costs of that ambition, the suffering that empires inflict, the hubris that leads to downfall. It is a puzzle, a vast repository of information that we are still learning to read, still trying to understand. And it is a connection to the past, a reminder that the people who walked here 3,000 years ago were not fundamentally different from us. They loved and feared and hoped and dreamed. They built cities and raised families and told stories. They believed their world would last forever, and they were wrong, but their belief was no less sincere for being mistaken. The story of Assyria is a story of rise and fall, of glory and destruction, of memory and forgetting. It is a story that begins in the dust of the Mesopotamian plain and ends in the museums and libraries of the modern world, where scholars piece together fragments of a lost civilization. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of our own world, the impermanence of our own empires, whether political or economic or technological. We build our towers and walls, we create our systems of control and organization. We imagine that we have escaped the limitations that doomed previous civilizations. But the ruins of Nineveh stand as a silent commentary on that illusion. And yet, there is also something inspiring in the story. Against all odds, something of Assyria survived. The tablets remained, waiting to be read. The reliefs, though many were destroyed, still show us the faces of kings and gods. The stories, though fragmented, still speak to us. The human capacity to create, to imagine, to build something larger than ourselves, is testified to by every fragment of carved stone, every line of cuneiform text. The empire fell, but the civilization left traces, and those traces allow us to recover something of what was lost. As we conclude this journey through the empire that time forgot, it is worth reflecting on what we can learn from Assyria. Not simple lessons about good and evil, not moralizing about the dangers of imperialism, though those reflections have their place, but deeper lessons about the human condition, that we are capable of both great cruelty and great creativity, often in the same breath, that our works are more fragile than we believe, but also more enduring than we fear, that the past is not dead, not really, as long as we are willing to listen to the voices that echo across the centuries, that every civilization, no matter how powerful, is a brief moment in the long story of humanity, but that each moment matters, each attempt to build something lasting deserves to be remembered and understood. The empire that time forgot is being remembered again, piece by piece, tablet by tablet. We are reconstructing it, not perfectly, never completely, but enough to see its outlines, to understand its achievements and failures, to place it in the long arc of human history. We do this not because Assyria was particularly virtuous or particularly villainous, but because it was there, because it was human, because its story is part of our story. And so, as the sun sets over the ruins of Nineveh, as the light fades and the stars begin to appear in the sky above Mesopotamia, the same stars that Assyrian priests charted 3,000 years ago, we take our leave of this vanished world. We have walked its streets, stood in its palaces, listened to the voices of its kings and scribes. We have witnessed its rise and its fall. We have seen how an empire can dominate the world and then vanish almost without a trace, leaving only ruins and memories and clay tablets baked hard by fire. The story is ended, but the questions it raises remain. What makes a civilization endure? What causes it to fall? How should we remember the powerful and the defeated, the conquerors and the conquered? These are questions without easy answers, questions each generation must grapple with anew, but perhaps that is the real gift of history. Not answers, but questions, not certainty, but the opportunity to think deeply about where we come from and where we are going. Thank you for taking this journey with me into the deep past, to the empire that time forgot. May you carry with you some sense of the grandeur and tragedy of Assyria, some appreciation for the complexity of the ancient world, and some humility in the face of the long sweep of history. And now, as the night deepens and the modern world awaits, rest well. Let your thoughts drift where they will, among the ruins of Nineveh, the halls of Ashurbanipal's library, the banks of the ancient Tigris. Sleep well, and dream of distant ages, of empires risen and fallen, of the endless human story written in stone and clay and memory. Until we meet again on another journey into the past, good night.